The gravel crunched under the polished soles of Ronald Newsom's handmade Italian loafers, a sound that usually signified arrival and power, but today felt like the grinding of teeth. He stood beside his dark blue luxury sedan, the hood still ticking as the engine cooled, and stared at the beige stone facade of his estate. It was a fortress of success, a monument to a man who had conquered the steel industry, yet to Ronald, it had become nothing more than a gilded cage for the only person he actually cared about. His mother, Catherine, sat 30 yards away, in the center of a perfectly manicured lawn, framed by the vibrant reds and soft pinks of the estate's prize-winning roses. At 78, she looked like a delicate porcelain doll left out in the sun. Weathered, silver-haired and heartbreakingly still, she wore a blue cardigan despite the midday heat, her lifeless legs draped with a cashmere throw that cost more than most people's cars. Ronald adjusted his navy blue tie, a nervous habit that surfaced only when he felt the suffocating weight of his own helplessness. He was a billionaire. He was used to bending the world to his will with a phone call or a wire transfer, but as he looked at Catherine, he was reminded of the $50 million he had bled out over the last decade in a desperate failed pursuit of a miracle. His mind drifted back to the sterile high-tech clinics in Zurich, where Swiss neurologists had mapped her brain with lasers and spoke in hushed, expensive tones about synaptic firing and irreversible trauma. He remembered the 3 months they had spent in Japan, where robotic exoskeletons were strapped to her frail frame, forcing her legs to move in a grotesque, mechanical parody of walking, only for her to collapse the moment the power was cut. Then there were the experimental stem cell treatments in Germany, the hyperbaric chambers, and the physical therapists who came with world-class reputations and hourly rates that could buy a small home. "Everything money can buy," Ronald whispered to the empty driveway, his voice thick with a bitterness that no vintage scotch could wash away. He had provided her with the best of everything: a wheelchair engineered from aerospace-grade carbon fiber, a team of nurses who moved with the hushed efficiency of ghosts, and a life scrubbed clean of any discomfort or exertion. He had built her a world of soft edges and warm water, a paradise where she never had to lift a finger, and in doing so, he realized with a sudden, cold pang of dread, he had simply made her prison more comfortable. He watched a petal fall from a rosebush and land on her lap. She didn't brush it away. She didn't even seem to notice it. For 12 years her world had been defined by what she couldn't do, and Ronald had spent every one of those years reinforcing that reality with his wealth. He was the king of steel, yet he couldn't forge a single working connection between his mother's mind and her feet. As he started toward her, his shadow stretching long and dark across the pristine grass, he had no idea that the invisible woman standing near the garden shed, the new maid, Grace, was about to challenge the very foundation of his expensive, hopeless world. Ronald watched as Zara, the maid he had barely acknowledged for weeks, moved toward the garden faucet with a strange, purposeful stride. She didn't look like a woman about to perform a chore. She looked like a commander preparing for battle. When she reached for the coiled green garden hose, Ronald didn't think much of it. Perhaps she was going to water the hydrangeas near the porch, but then she turned, the brass nozzle glinting in the sun, and walked directly toward his mother. "I'll wash your mom and she'll walk," Zara had said just moments ago, a claim so absurd it had barely registered as a sentence. Ronald was still mid-scoff, his lips curled in a mocking smile, when the sound of rushing water hissed through the air. Without a word of warning, Zara squeezed the trigger, and a jet of cold, pressurized water arched through the afternoon light, splashing directly onto Catherine's silver hair. "What are you doing? Are you in?" Ronald's scream tore through the quiet of the estate, a raw, jagged sound that sent birds scattering from the rose bushes. He bolted forward, his expensive shoes skidding on the grass, his hands reaching out to shove Zara away from the wheelchair. He saw his mother flinch, her eyes snapping wide as the water drenched her blue cardigan, and began to stream down her weathered face. It was a sight of pure, unadulterated chaos, in a world he spent millions to keep orderly. But as he reached for the hose, Zara didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She simply stepped into his path, her eyes steady and cold as the water she was spraying. There was a quiet, unshakable authority in her gaze that acted like an invisible wall, stopping the billionaire in his tracks. "Stop," she said, her voice a low, resonant calm that cut through his hysteria. You've spent 12 years keeping her safe, Mr. Wellington. Now let me keep her alive. Ronald froze, his chest heaving, his fingers inches from the nozzle. He looked at his mother, who was shivering now, the water soaking into the cashmere and silk he had used to bury her spirit. For the first time in a decade, Catherine wasn't just a calm porcelain doll. She was reacting. She was gasping. She was present. Your mother hasn't walked because you've turned her world into a lukewarm bath, Zara continued, her voice never rising, even as she redirected the spray toward Catherine's lifeless legs. Doctors treat the body, but they ignore the mind. They use warm water and gentle touches, so the nerves have nothing to respond to. They've gone to sleep because you made them too comfortable. Ronald felt the anger and the guilt warring in his chest, a physical pain that made his breath catch. He wanted to fire her, to call the police, to scream that she was a fraud. But as he looked at Catherine's face, he saw something he hadn't seen in Switzerland, Japan, or Germany. In the midst of the cold water shock, he saw a spark of focus in his mother's eyes, a fierce, primitive concentration that no $50 million treatment had ever managed to ignite. He stood there, soaking wet and trembling, caught between the billionaire he was and the son he desperately needed to be. The garden, usually a place of sterile perfection, was now a scene of damp, chaotic tension. Ronald stood knee-deep in the sodden grass, his eyes darting between the relentless jet of water and his mother's shivering frame. Zara kept the hose steady, her expression as unmovable as a statue, while Ronald's mind raced with a decade's worth of medical jargon that suddenly felt like useless paper. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died in his throat as Zara began to speak, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very air. Everything you've done for her, Newsom, was built on the idea that she is broken, Zara said, the water splashing against the stone patio, with a rhythmic beat. You hired the best nurses to be gentle. You bought the softest cashmere to protect her skin. You insisted on warm water for every bath, so she would never feel a chill. You thought you were being kind, but you were actually building a wall between her and the world. Ronald looked at Catherine, whose face was pale, her eyes fixed on Zara with a frightening intensity. Zara didn't look away from the spray, her gaze focused on the way the water pooled around Catherine's ankles. The body is an instrument of response, Zara continued. It needs pressure, it needs temperature, it needs a reason to fight. But for 12 years you fed her nothing but comfort. You turned off the alarms in her nervous system because you were too afraid of her feeling pain. When there is no pain, no cold and no struggle, the nerves simply stop listening. They've forgotten they are alive because you've made it too easy for them to be dead. A cold realization settled in Ronald's gut, sharper than the spray of the hose. He remembered the physical therapists who had moved his mother's legs with the delicacy of handling ancient glass, always stopping the second she winced. He had encouraged that gentleness. He had paid for it. He had demanded that she be kept in a state of constant, unchanging luxury. Comfort is a trap, Mr. Newsom, Zara said, finally turning the nozzle to a sharper, more focused stream that hit Catherine's knees with a visible thud. It's the most expensive coffin you can buy. She doesn't need your protection anymore. She needs to be shocked back into her own skin. She needs to feel the bite of the cold so her brain remembers there is a body down there worth fighting for. Ronald felt a tremor in his own hand. He looked at the luxury cars and the sprawling mansion, the symbols of the protection he had provided. For the first time they didn't look like achievements. They looked like the bars of the cell Zara was describing. He watched a single drop of cold water roll down his mother's cheek, and for a fleeting second, he saw her jaw set in a way he hadn't seen since she was the one running the empire. She wasn't being treated, she was being challenged. And for the first time in 12 years, the billionaire found himself unable to look away. The rhythmic drumming of the water against the wheelchair was the only sound in the garden, a relentless pulse that seemed to beat in time with the throbbing in Ronald's temples. He stood paralyzed, his eyes fixed on the way Catherine's knuckles had turned white as she gripped the armrest. Zara's words about the comfort trap were still echoing in his mind, but it was her next question that truly made the earth shift beneath his feet. When was the last time any of those high-priced experts actually examined her? Zara asked, her voice quiet but piercing through the splash of the hose. Ronald opened his mouth to answer,
a defensive retort about the millions spent already on the tip of his tongue, but he stopped. He reached into his memory, searching for the date of the last consultation, the last MRI, the last specialist who had actually laid hands on his mother. He saw the images of the Swiss clinic, the robotic labs in Japan, the experimental center in Germany, but those memories were layered in dust. "I was 7 years ago," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Maybe 6, after the 5th neurologist in Munich told me there was 0 chance of neural regeneration. I stopped. I didn't want to put her through the heartbreak anymore. I didn't want to torture her with false hope." "So for 7 years you've based her entire life on old data," Zara said, not with malice but with a clinical coldness that made Ronald feel small. "You accepted a final verdict from men who saw her when the injury was fresh, and the trauma was peaking. You haven't checked to see if her body has been trying to heal itself in secret, because you were too busy protecting her from the truth." Ronald felt a wave of nausea. He looked at his mother, who was staring at him with a mixture of sorrow and newfound clarity. He had prided himself on being her protector, her provider, the man who gave her everything. But he realized now that by accepting the word permanent as gospel, he had essentially buried her alive in a world of luxury and silk. He had assumed the doctors were gods and that their data was eternal, never considering that the human body and his mother's spirit might have been working in the silence of those 7 years. "Medical science is amazing, Newsom, but doctors see what they expect to see," Zara said, shifting the hose to the small of Catherine's back. "Nobody expected her to heal, so nobody looked for it, and because you stopped looking, she stopped trying." Ronald sank to his knees in the mud, his $100 trousers soaking up the garden grime, as the weight of his own well-intentioned negligence finally broke him. The cold water continued to cascade over Catherine's legs, soaking through her heavy blue trousers, until they clung to her skin like a second freezing layer of armor. Ronald, still on his knees in the damp earth, watched the water pool around his shoes, his breath coming in ragged hitches as he looked up at the woman who had raised him. The clinical distance he had maintained for years was gone, replaced by a raw, pulsing desperation that hurt more than any corporate loss he had ever endured. "Mr. Newsom, come here," Zara commanded, her voice cutting through the roar of the water and the wind in the tree. "I want you to see something, but I need you to do exactly as I say. Put the hose down for a moment, but keep your hand on her." Zara handed him the green nozzle, and as Ronald took it, the vibration of the rushing water seemed to travel up his arm and straight into his chest. "I want you to press your hand against her left leg," Zara instructed, pointing to a spot just above Catherine's knee. "And don't be gentle. Do not treat her like she is made of glass. Press hard, not with your fingertips but with your weight. Give her a reason to notice you are there." Ronald hesitated, his fingers trembling. For 12 years, his entire interaction with his mother's body had been a series of light touches, soft kisses on the forehead, and careful adjustments of her pillows. The idea of applying force felt like a sacrilege. But he looked at Zara's unwavering eyes and then at his mother's face, which was tight with a focus so intense it looked like pain. He reached out and pressed his palm against the soaked fabric of her trousers. He pushed, feeling the unyielding, atrophied muscle beneath. He pushed harder, leaning his shoulder into the movement, until his knuckles turned white against her skin. Suddenly, Catherine gasped. Her eyes, which had been clouded with the fog of age and medication for years, snapped wide and clear. "Ronald," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread that threatened to break. I felt that. I actually felt that." Ronald's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "What, Mum? How?" "The specialists said the nerves were dead. They said the signal couldn't get through." "They were wrong," Catherine said, a single tear escaping her eye and mixing with the cold garden water on her cheek. She looked down at his hand, still pressing firmly against her leg. "The truth is, Ronald, I've felt things, little things, for years. A tingle when the weather changed, a dull pressure when the nurses moved me too quickly. But I was so afraid." "Afraid of what?" Ronald asked, his voice cracking. "Of disappointing you," she said, her voice gaining a sudden fierce strength. "You spent so much money, Ron. You brought me the best doctors in the world, and every time they shook their heads and said there was no hope, I saw your heart break. I thought if I told you I felt a tiny spark and then it turned out to be nothing, it would destroy you. So I stayed quiet. I stayed safe in this chair, because it was easier to be paralyzed than to fail you again." Ronald felt as if he had been slapped. "The $50 million, The Swiss clinics, the Japanese robotics. It hadn't just been a medical failure. It had been a psychological prison he had built for her with his own grief. He had been protecting her from disappointment, while she had been protecting him from his own desperate hope. You were burying her alive in kindness, Zara said softly, the hose still hissing as she turned the water back onto Catherine's feet. But she's not dead, Mr. Newsom. She's just been waiting for a reason to wake up, and now, the cold is giving her that reason. Ronald didn't let go. He kept his hand pressed hard against her leg, feeling the first faint, impossible tremor of a muscle trying to remember how to live. The garden air seemed to thicken, the scent of wet earth and roses hanging heavy as the moment of truth arrived. Ronald stood paralyzed in the driveway of his beige stone mansion, his hands pressed firmly against his temples in a gesture of absolute, soul-shaking shock. His navy blue suit was stained with mud, and soaked with the spray from the garden hose, but he didn't feel the he could only stare at his mother, Catherine, whose weathered face was contorted with a level of effort that looked like a battle for life itself. Standing beside her, Zara held the green hose steady, the water still washing over Catherine's silver hair and soaking her blue cardigan, creating a shimmering veil of cold and hope. Mr. Newsom, stand back, but do not look away, Zara commanded, her voice the only steady thing in a world that had gone sideways. She positioned herself directly in front of the wheelchair, her hands extended like a lifeline, her eyes locked onto Catherine. We are not looking for a miracle today, Catherine. We are looking for a choice. You have to choose to leave the safety of this chair. Catherine gripped the armrests of the carbon fiber wheelchair, her knuckles white and shaking, her eyes wide with a terror that Ronald felt in his own marrow. I'm going to count to 3, Zara said, her voice dropping to a low rhythmic cadence that seemed to pulse through the garden. On 3, you push. You don't think about the Switzerland doctors. You don't think about the millions of dollars. You just think about the ground beneath your feet. Ronald's heart pounded so loudly, he feared it would drown out her voice. He was frozen, the billionaire, who had everything, yet could do nothing but watch. 1, Zara called out. Catherine's breathing became a series of sharp, jagged gasps. 2, Ronald saw the muscles in his mother's forearms cord with tension, her shoulders hunching as she gathered every ounce of her remaining will. 3, Zara's voice cracked like a whip across the lawn. In that instant, the impossible happened. Ronald's breath hitched in his throat as he saw Catherine's legs, the legs he had been told were permanently dead for 7 years, begin to tremble violently. With a guttural cry that sounded like a dormant engine turning over, she pushed. Her weight shifted, the wheelchair creaked, and suddenly, there was daylight between her body and the seat. She rose 1 inch, then 2, then a full 3 inches off the cushion, her body hovering in the air sustained by nothing but sheer, agonizing effort. Ronald froze, his mouth agape, his hands still clamped to his head as he witnessed the shattering of his cynical reality. For 4 heart-stopping seconds, Catherine stood, her frame shaking against the gravity that had claimed her for a decade. Then, her strength evaporated, and she collapsed back into the chair with a heavy thud. The garden went silent, save for the sound of the water still hitting the grass, and the sudden explosive sound of Catherine's sob. She covered her face with her wet hands, her body racked with tears of both exhaustion and absolute triumph. Ronald couldn't move, couldn't speak, he just stood there in the mud, a billionaire, who had finally seen something money could never buy. The orange and pink hues of the setting sun bled across the sky, casting long dramatic shadows over the rose garden and reflecting off the wet gravel of the driveway. Ronald remained rooted to the spot, his hands finally dropping from his temples to his sides, his expensive suit now a ruined mess of mud and cold water. He watched as Zara reached out her hands, not to pull Catherine up, but to offer a target, a destination. The garden hose lay discarded on the grass, still hissing a small trickle of water, but the silence between the 3 of them was heavier than any sound. Again Zara said, her voice a calm anchor in the midst of Catherine's sobbing. The fear has caught up to you, Catherine. You have to move, before it settles back into your bones. Stand up, and walk to me. Ronald started to step forward, his instinct to protect flaring up one last time. Zara, she's exhausted. That's too much, he began, but his mother's voice cut him off with a sharp, unexpected ferocity. I can do it, Catherine said, wiping the mixture of tears and cold water from her eyes. She looked at Zara, her gaze locking onto the maid's extended hands with a desperate, holy trust. Catherine gripped the armrests again, but this time, The movement was different. It wasn't a frantic struggle, but a calculated gathering of strength. She pushed herself up, her legs shaking so violently that Ronald feared they would snap like dry kindling. Yet she stood fully upright, her body swaying in the evening breeze, no longer touching the wheelchair that had been her world for 12 years. Ronald held his breath, tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "You're doing it." One step, Zara encouraged, moving back just 2 feet, forcing the distance to exist. Catherine lifted her right foot, a heavy, wobbling movement that seemed to take an eternity, and placed it down firmly on the grass. Then came the left. It was a staggering, clumsy motion, but it was she took a second, and then a third, her body leaning forward until she finally collapsed into Zara's arms, both of them sobbing and laughing as they sank onto the lawn. Ronald collapsed with them, wrapping his arms around both women, finally understanding that the 3 impossible steps he had just witnessed were worth more than every billion he had ever made. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the garden in a soft violet twilight that blurred the edges of the mansion and the mud-stained figures on the grass. Ronald sat on the damp earth, his hands trembling as he touched his mother's legs, feeling the warmth of circulating blood and the faint rhythmic twitch of recovering muscles. The silence of the estate was no longer heavy with the stagnation of a hospital wing. It was light, filled with the ragged, joyful breathing of a woman who had just reclaimed her life. Ronald looked up at Zara, who stood a few paces away, brushing the wet grass and garden debris from her apron, with a steady hand that betrayed no shock at the miracle she had just registered. "How did you know?" Ronald asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. He looked at the garden hose, then back at the woman he had treated as an invisible servant just hours before. "You challenged every doctor in Europe and Asia. You risked her safety. You risked my wrath. No one, no expert, no scientist would have ever dared to do what you just. How could you be so sure?" Zara paused, her fingers lingering on the white fabric of her apron. She looked out toward the dark line of hedges, her gaze drifting to a place far beyond the boundaries of the Newsom estate. "I didn't learn this from a textbook, Mr. Newsom," she said quietly, her voice carrying a trace of an old, hard-earned pain. "I knew because 7 years ago, I was sitting where your mother is now. I was 22, and a car accident had crushed my lower spine. The doctors in the public wards gave me the same speech they gave you in the private clinics. Permanent, irreversible. They told me to get used to the view from a seated position." Ronald felt the world tilt. He stared at her steady legs, the way she stood with such effortless grace on the uneven ground. "You were paralyzed." Zara nodded, a small sad smile touching her lips. "For 3 long years, I lived in that same cage of comfort you built for Catherine. My family was poor, but they were kind. They carried me. They bathed me in warm water. They did everything so I wouldn't have to struggle. I was withering away in their love, until a therapist from the old country came to our village. He didn't use robotics or expensive drugs. He took me outside in the dead of winter, and he poured a bucket of well water over me. I hated him for it. I screamed just like you did." She stepped closer, the moonlight catching the divine light. "Ronald had noticed early. He told me that my body had gone into a deep sleep because it was being protected from the world. He used the cold to shock my system awake, and he refused to let me stay safe. He made me fight the ice, fight the pressure, and fight the gravity I had surrendered to. It took months of agony, but eventually, the nerves had to listen. They had no choice but to respond to the crisis." Ronald looked at his mother, who was listening with wide, tear-filled eyes. The billionaire realized then that Zara hadn't taken the job as a maid because she needed the meager salary. She had sought out the hopeless cases that wealth had tried to bury in silk. She was a survivor who had turned her trauma into a silent, powerful weapon against the word impossible. "That's why I'm here," Zara whispered, "to help people remember they aren't broken, just forgotten by a world that values comfort over the struggle of being alive." Ronald reached out, not to offer a check or a contract, but to simply touch the hem of her apron in a gesture of profound, humbled gratitude. 4 months had passed since the gravel of the driveway had been soaked with garden water and tears, and the Newsom estate no longer felt like a silent mausoleum of steel and stone. The heavy, medicinal scent that once clung to the hallways had been replaced by the fragrance of open windows and fresh jasmine. Ronald Newsom sat in his expansive corner office, but the King of Steel looked different. The sharp, aggressive edges of his posture had softened. He was no longer looking at a spreadsheet of losses. but out toward the garden where his life had been rewritten. The heavy oak doors of his office creaked open, but it wasn't the sound of a nurse's rubber-soled shoes or the motorized hum of a wheelchair that followed. Instead, there was a rhythmic, steady thump-tap, thump-tap. Ronald stood up so quickly, his leather chair rolled back against the window. Catherine stepped into the room, dressed in a vibrant emerald suit, her silver hair styled with a renewed elegance. She wasn't being pushed. She wasn't being carried. She was upright, her weight supported by a simple polished walnut cane, and the strength of her own reconstructed will. Ronald felt a lump form in his throat, a familiar sensation that he no longer tried to suppress with corporate stoicism. He crossed the room in 3 strides, but he stopped a foot away, honoring the distance she had worked so hard to bridge herself. Catherine looked at him, her eyes bright and piercing, the old data of her paralysis, now a ghost of the past. She took one more step, the cane clicking firmly against the hardwood, and reached out to squeeze his arm. Her grip was strong, real, human pressure that needed no Swiss specialist to verify. "You're late for tea, Ronald," she teased, her voice steady and full of the life that had been buried alive for 12 years. Ronald laughed, a sound that finally reached his eye. He looked past her, to see Zara standing in the doorway. She was no longer wearing the maid's apron. She wore the professional attire of the head of the Newsom Rehabilitation Foundation, a wing of Ronald's empire he had established to find the invisible people trapped in the same luxury prisons he had once built. He had promoted her instantly, not as an act of charity, but because he finally recognized a value that couldn't be calculated on a balance sheet. The Sunday ritual had become the cornerstone of their new life. Every week they gathered in the garden, not to hide away from the world, but to celebrate the struggle of being in it. Ronald had sold the dark blue luxury car that had sat idle during his moment of shock, and replaced the clinical best with the miraculous simple. As they walked together toward the rose bushes, Catherine leading the way with her cane, Ronald looked at the green garden hose still coiled by the faucet. It was no longer a tool for chores, it was a monument. He realized that his millions had bought him comfort, but it was a woman with a bucket of cold water, and the courage to refuse to give up who had given him back his mother. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the 3 of them, Ronald Newsom finally understood that the greatest miracles don't happen in laboratories, but in the hearts of those who believe that no one is ever truly broken, only forgotten.